In the bustling courthouse of Springfield, the air was thick with tension as Judge Patrick Holden took his seat behind the wooden bench. His eyes scanned the courtroom briefly before settling on the defendant, Maya Johnson, who stood at the center of the room. Her hands were clasped tightly together in front of her as she stared straight ahead with a quiet intensity. Her expression was unreadable, but her posture spoke volumes. She had been through this before, and the cold efficiency of the system seemed almost second nature to her. Maya was accused of shoplifting a designer purse from a high-end boutique in downtown Springfield. The store owner, a middle-aged man with a sharp suit and even sharper eyes, had been quick to press charges as soon as he saw Maya slipping the purse into her bag. She had been caught on camera, though the footage was grainy at best and barely conclusive. The defense attorney argued that Maya had been wrongly accused, but the facts didn't seem to favor her. Judge Holden didn't need much convincing. He had seen cases like this 100 times before, and his patience was wearing thin. There were criminals who made poor choices, and there were criminals who simply never learned their lesson. Maya Johnson was the latter in his mind, a woman with a criminal record, caught in a petty crime not worthy of much attention. As the trial proceeded, Maya remained silent. For the most part, she had kept her head down and spoken little during the proceedings. Her defense attorney tried to paint a picture of a woman who had fallen on hard times, someone who had once been a part of the city's elite, but had been forced to live on the streets after a series of personal losses. Her story was one of hardship, but also of broken promises. But Judge Holden had little patience for sympathy. He had seen too many people like Maya, who claimed to be the victims of circumstance, but never seemed to take responsibility for their actions. The prosecutor pressed for a harsh sentence based on her criminal history. Maya had been arrested twice before for similar crimes, petty theft and shoplifting, though nothing as serious as this incident. Judge Holden listened carefully to both sides, but his decision was already made. He wasn't here to save someone who had clearly made their own bed. The courtroom fell silent as he cleared his throat and glanced down at the sentencing guidelines in front of him. He looked back up at Maya and saw her still and unflinching. Her gaze never wavered from the floor, but there was something in her calmness that struck him. He couldn't place it, but it felt as though she was waiting for something that she had already come to terms with. With a final nod to himself, Judge Holden spoke the words that would change everything. He sentenced Maya to 5 years in prison for the theft with no possibility of parole. His voice was steady, but there was an underlying firmness to it, as though he was sealing her fate. Maya didn't react. She simply nodded as if she had expected it all along and was ready to face whatever came next. The bailiff began to move toward her, and the room filled with the sound of shifting papers and the shuffle of feet. But Judge Holden couldn't shake the strange feeling that had settled in his chest. He had done his job, he had followed the law, but something about this case didn't sit right with him, not now, not after he had seen Maya's calm expression one more time. That evening, Judge Patrick Holden sat alone in his study, the dim glow of a desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. His thoughts kept drifting back to Maya Johnson. The courtroom was a distant memory now, but her quiet demeanor haunted him. There was something about her that didn't align with the case, a sharp contrast to the hardened criminal he had expected to see. Her calmness, her lack of reaction, felt unsettling in a way he couldn't fully explain. His mind kept replaying the moments leading up to the sentence, and no matter how many times he reviewed the evidence, the unease remained. He stood up from his desk and paced for a few minutes, running his hands through his hair, trying to clear his head. His eyes wandered over the files stacked neatly on his desk, cases to be handled tomorrow, decisions to be made. But Maya's case stuck out like a sore thumb. Judge Holden was known for his firm judgments, his unyielding stance on the law. Yet with her, something fell off. It wasn't that he regretted the sentence. It was more the way she had looked at him, as if she knew something he didn't. He shook the thought away, but it persisted. Opening his laptop, he started to browse through some news articles, looking for anything new about the case, any information that could justify his decision. His eyes skimmed the local news until an image caught his attention. It was a picture from a charity gala held by the Griffins, one of Springfield's wealthiest families. The article highlighted the evening's event, filled with familiar faces from the city's high society. His gaze fixed on a woman in the background, Maya Johnson, The caption beneath the photo read, "Maya Johnson, daughter of Richard Griffin, at the annual charity dinner for homeless youth." Holden's heart skipped a beat. He clicked on the image and opened a full-sized version, staring at her face. Maya Johnson. The name sounded so familiar, but he had never made the connection. The Griffins were a name spoken with reverence in Springfield. Richard Griffin, a wealthy businessman and philanthropist, was a fixture in the city's upper circles. He was known for his contributions to various causes and his status as one of Springfield's elite families. Maya, though, had never been mentioned in connection with him. The news article seemed to suggest that she had once been part of this world, a world far removed from the woman he had seen in his courtroom. He quickly began searching through old articles about Richard Griffin. There were mentions of his family, his business dealings, and various charitable works. But there was nothing about Maya. Why hadn't she been listed as part of this world? The more he searched, the more a troubling picture began to form in his mind. Could it be that Maya, the woman he had sentenced so harshly, was once a part of one of Springfield's most influential families? A knot tightened in his stomach. Judge Holden closed his laptop, a feeling of disbelief washing over him. The thought that he had sentenced someone with such a significant and complex background, someone who might have been at the pinnacle of success only to fall so far, struck him deeply. He had been so quick to judge, to assume that Maya was just another repeat offender, a product of her environment, without considering the possibility that there was much more to her story than met the eye. The weight of his decision pressed on him as he sat back down at his desk. It was clear now that he had made a grave error, one that could not be undone. But how much damage had he done? And how could he fix it? There was no easy answer, but he knew one thing for certain. He needed to find out more about Maya Johnson. He couldn't let this case end like this, not without understanding the truth. The news of Maya Johnson's sentencing quickly spread through Springfield, and it didn't take long for the community to react. In a town where social issues often stayed hidden behind polite facades, Maya's case struck a raw nerve. People were talking, whispers in coffee shops, heated discussions in local churches, and fervent conversations in living rooms. Many were outraged, not just by her sentence, but by the seemingly cold, callous way in which the justice system had handled her case. To them, Maya represented more than just a woman accused of a crime. She was a symbol of a system that treated some people differently than others based on assumptions, not facts. Local attorney Lucy Carter, known for her work in criminal justice reform, was among the first to take notice. She had heard about the case from a friend and was immediately struck by how the trial had unfolded. Lucy had seen this kind of thing before. A judge who made snap decisions based on the superficial, who saw a black woman with a criminal history and presumed she was guilty of everything the system said she was. But what troubled her most was the nagging sense that there was more to Maya's story than met the eye. Lucy decided to dig deeper. The more she learned, the more she realized just how wrong the system had been in Maya's case. Her first call was to a former high school teacher of Maya's, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, who had taught Maya English during her senior year. When Lucy explained the situation, Mrs. Brooks was shocked. She had known Maya as a bright and ambitious student, someone with a strong sense of justice and a dream of becoming a lawyer. Maya had been the type of student who stayed after class to discuss big ideas, to talk about the kind of world she wanted to help create. But after graduation, Mrs. Brooks lost touch with her. "I never would have imagined her ending up like this," Mrs. Brooks said, her voice heavy with disbelief. "Maya had so much potential. I remember she was set to go to college. She had a scholarship to a good school, but something happened. Her father, Richard Griffin, pulled away from her around that time, and I heard she had some personal struggles." Lucy's curiosity grew. She made more calls, reaching out to old friends of Maya's and former colleagues of Richard Griffin, hoping to uncover more. What she found was a picture of a woman who had once been part of Springfield's elite, but had fallen from grace in ways no one fully understood. Maya's life had been shattered by a series of personal losses: her parents' bitter divorce, her father's financial troubles, and the isolation that followed. Richard Griffin, once a wealthy businessman and philanthropist, had pulled away from Maya after the divorce. There were whispers that Maya had struggled with depression and addiction after her family fell apart, and that she had lived on the streets for a time before finding work as a waitress. But what troubled Lucy the most was the realization that Maya had never been afforded the chance to explain this context to the court. The prosecutor had only focused on Maya's criminal history, and Judge Holden had relied solely on what he saw before him in the courtroom. A woman who looked defeated, whose past seemed unremarkable, but Maya's history, her struggles, and the emotional toll of her family's collapse hadn't been considered at all. Lucy knew this wasn't just about a case of one woman's conviction. It was about a larger issue. Maya's story wasn't an isolated one. It was a story that reflected the systemic issues in how the justice system viewed people from marginalized communities. It was about the way certain faces were judged before a word was spoken, before any of the context was even considered. And Lucy was determined to make sure that Maya's voice would be heard. She began organizing a rally to raise awareness about Maya's case, calling on local activists, community leaders, and concerned citizens to join her cause. But she knew that it wouldn't be enough to simply make noise. She needed to prove that Maya was more than just a criminal. She needed to show the world the woman behind the headlines. The deeper Lucy Carter dug into Maya Johnson's past, the more she realized just how little had been known about the woman standing trial in Judge Patrick Holden's courtroom. With each new conversation, another piece of Maya's story fell into place. Pieces that painted a very different picture than the one presented during the trial. What had been missing all along was the larger context of Maya's life, the trauma and heartbreak that had led her down a path of desperation. Maya's estranged mother, Elaine Griffin, was reluctant to speak at first. It had been years since she had spoken to her daughter, and their relationship had been strained for a long time. But when Lucy explained the situation, Elaine finally agreed to meet. They sat in a small, quiet cafe in downtown Springfield, the clinking of coffee cups and soft murmurs of conversation surrounding them. Elaine, a woman in her late 50s with graying hair and a quiet demeanor, spoke slowly as she reflected on her daughter's childhood. She recalled the early years when Maya had been full of promise, always striving for excellence in everything she did. She was always different from the others, Elaine said, her voice tinged with a mix of pride and sadness. She wasn't interested in the usual things. She didn't want to just be a part of the social scene. Maya wanted to make a difference. I thought she would go far. When Elaine and Richard divorced, everything changed. The once wealthy Griffins had struggled to maintain their lifestyle, and their marriage had crumbled under the pressure. Maya, caught between two worlds, was left feeling abandoned and adrift. Her father, Richard, had grown increasingly distant after the divorce, throwing himself into his business and his own personal battles. Elaine, who had been struggling to make ends meet herself, said that Maya had felt neglected. She was angry. At me? At her father? At the world? Elaine recalled, her eyes welling with tears. She didn't know where she belonged anymore. It wasn't long before Maya's academic prospects began to fade. Without the support of her father and with the emotional toll of her family's breakdown, Maya lost her scholarship to college. Soon, she was living on the streets, turning to menial jobs to survive, and slowly spiraling into addiction. Elaine's voice grew softer as she spoke about how she had tried to reach out to Maya over the years. I tried, but she was always so distant. I don't think she ever truly forgave me for leaving her father, and maybe she never forgave me for not being able to save her. The conversation weighed heavily on Lucy's heart, but it was also crucial to understanding the woman behind the court case. Maya wasn't a repeat offender who had simply chosen a life of crime. She was a woman deeply scarred by family trauma who had never been given the opportunity to heal. Her descent into hardship was not the result of laziness or a lack of willpower, but the heartbreaking consequences of losing her family and the support systems that should have been there for her. After the meeting, Lucy made a plan to gather more evidence. She reached out to a few of Maya's former mentors, people who had known her in her youth and remembered the bright, hopeful young woman she once was. One of these people was Reverend James Riley, the pastor at the church where Maya had volunteered during her teenage years. Reverend Riley was a kind-hearted man who had always believed in Maya's potential. She was a natural leader, he recalled. She organized charity drives and helped mentor younger kids. She had a heart for people in need. I always thought she would do great things. Lucy began to piece together the larger narrative, a woman whose promising future had been derailed by the collapse of her family, who had been left to pick up the broken pieces alone. This wasn't just a case of theft. It was a story of loss, abandonment, and resilience. Maya wasn't a criminal. She was a woman who had been broken by life's circumstances but had never lost her desire to help others. Armed with this newfound knowledge, Lucy knew she had to act quickly. She contacted a few allies, including a local journalist who had been following Maya's case, and they began preparing to present a new, more complete picture of Maya's life to the public. They needed to show that her actions, while wrong, had been the product of a system that had failed her, and that it was time for that system to make things right. As Maya's story began to gain traction in the community, Judge Holden found himself increasingly unsettled by what he was learning. He had read through the reports again and again, but now, with the full scope of Maya's life laid out before him, his conviction wavered. He felt a deep sense of responsibility, as though he had played a part in a tragedy that could have been avoided. Maya Johnson wasn't just a criminal, she was a victim of a broken system. Judge Patrick Holden could no longer escape the weight of his conscience. The more he learned about Maya Johnson, the more his guilt gnawed at him. Each new piece of her story painted a portrait of a woman who had been deeply hurt by forces beyond her control, forces he had failed to understand when he passed that fateful sentence. As he sat at his desk late one night, sifting through the files, the enormity of his mistake hit him all over again. Maya was not just another criminal in a courtroom. She was a woman who had fallen through the cracks of a system that was supposed to protect and support her. The sentence he had handed down seemed so final, so irrevocable, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it could be a grave injustice. He had sentenced Maya to 5 years in prison, a decision made in the blink of an eye, without fully understanding her history or the factors that had led her to that moment. In the sterile, emotionless environment of the courtroom, Maya had seemed like just another defendant, someone who had failed to live up to expectations, someone who had made poor choices. But now, in the silence of his office, Holden understood how wrong he had been. He couldn't just move on, not now. Maya's face, her quiet dignity in the face of a harsh judgment, haunted him. She had been punished without a fair opportunity to tell her story. As a judge, it was his job to weigh the facts, but it was clear to him now that he had overlooked the most important fact of all: Maya's humanity. In the days following his sentencing, Holden found it difficult to focus on anything else. His usual confidence was shaken, and the case was starting to consume his every thought. He had tried to justify his decision to himself at first, reminding himself that the law was the law and he had followed it to the letter. But that rationalization no longer held up. Maya's background, her pain, her struggle, it all became undeniable. He had sentenced a woman whose path had been shaped by loss and hardship, not by malice or a desire to do wrong. That gnawing feeling, that restless discomfort, only deepened. He began to question his own biases. He had assumed, based on Maya's appearance and her criminal history, that she was a typical offender, someone who had simply chosen a life of crime. But that assumption had been dangerous. The system, he now realized, had failed to look beyond the surface, to understand the factors that had shaped Maya's choices and the circumstances that have led her to this point. Judge Holden knew he couldn't simply let this go. He couldn't just walk away from the case, feeling guilty but doing nothing. He needed to make things right. But how? His thoughts turned to Lucy Carter, the attorney who had been vocal about the injustice of Maya's sentencing. He had heard whispers of her organizing rallies and protests in support of Maya, but he had dismissed it as just another activist movement. Now, though, Lucy was the only person who seemed to be willing to dig deeper into Maya's story, to uncover the truth. She had already gathered evidence and spoken to people who knew Maya when she was younger. He needed her help. He needed to find a way to reopen the case, to give Maya a chance to tell her side of the story. In a moment of resolve, Judge Holden reached for the phone on his desk. His hand trembled slightly as he dialed Lucy Carter's number. When she picked up, he spoke with urgency, his voice betraying the weight of his decision. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I think I made a terrible mistake, and I want to fix it. Can you help me reopen Maya's case?" There was a pause on the other end, and then Lucy's voice came through, filled with both surprise and cautious optimism. "Of course," she said. "I've been waiting for you to realize that. Let's make sure she gets the chance she deserves." With that, Judge Holden knew that he had taken the first step toward making things right, but the road ahead would be anything but easy. There were legal hurdles to overcome, public pressure to navigate, and the harsh reality that Maya's life had already been irrevocably altered. He couldn't undo the damage she had caused, but he could help her find a path to redemption. And that, he hoped, would be the first step toward repairing the system he had once thought so flawless. The decision to reopen Maya Johnson's case sent ripples through Springfield, both within the legal system and the community. Judge Patrick Holden, once certain in his original ruling, now faced a storm of opposition. The public, though, seemed divided. Some people praised Holden for his newfound humility, admiring his willingness to confront his mistake. Others, particularly those who had long held faith in the justice system, were skeptical. They questioned why the judge had suddenly changed his mind, and some even accused him of being influenced by outside forces. Despite the mounting tension, Lucy Carter was more determined than ever. She worked tirelessly, reaching out to the key players from Maya's past to build a stronger case. Armed with the new information about Maya's troubled upbringing and her father's abandonment, she sought to prove that Maya wasn't just another petty criminal, but a victim of circumstances far beyond her control. One of the most important pieces of the puzzle was Maya's former counselor, Thomas Green. He had worked with her during the brief time she had been in rehab, and he had always believed in her potential. When Lucy reached out to him, he agreed to testify in Maya's favor, offering a stark contrast to the hardened image of the woman who had been in front of the judge. Maya was lost, Thomas said in an interview, but she wasn't beyond help. "I saw her struggle, but I also saw someone who wanted more for herself. She wasn't a criminal. She was a product of her circumstances, someone who had been broken by a system that didn't care." As the legal team worked behind the scenes, Maya remained in prison, though she held on to hope. Despite the harsh conditions, she never stopped thinking of the future. Her time behind bars had only strengthened her resolve to prove that she was capable of so much more than the mistakes she had made. She wrote letters to Lucy, her defense attorney, with updates on her thoughts and reflections. "I made mistakes," Maya wrote in one of her letters, "but I'm not a criminal. I just want to make something of myself again." At the same time, Judge Holden began to take a hard look at his role in the case. He was no longer the same man who had sentenced Maya without a second thought. He had spent hours reviewing her file, talking to colleagues, and reflecting on the process that had led to her conviction. There was no denying it. He had failed Maya, failed to see the full picture. And now, as he sat in his chambers late one night, he realized that this wasn't just about Maya's case. It was about a deeper flaw in the system itself. Too many people, particularly those from marginalized communities, were treated as though their stories didn't matter, as though their lives were disposable. Judge Holden had always prided himself on being a fair and impartial judge, but in Maya's case, he knew that bias had clouded his judgment. He had taken her past, her appearance, and her criminal record as proof that she was beyond redemption. He had assumed that because of her struggles, she was doomed to repeat her mistakes. But now he could see how flawed that thinking had been. The road to reopening the case was paved with challenges. There were protests, rallies, and vocal critics who argued that Holden was simply being swayed by public opinion. The defense had to overcome legal obstacles, as it wasn't common for a judge to reverse his own ruling. But Holden was determined. He believed in the power of redemption, and he now had a personal stake in proving that justice was more than just a series of rules. It was about understanding, empathy, and the willingness to right past wrongs. The day the motion to reopen Maya's case was officially filed, there was a sense of anticipation in the air. Lucy Carter stood outside the courthouse with a group of supporters, holding a sign that read, "Justice for Maya." Reporters crowded around, eager for any updates. It was a pivotal moment not just for Maya, but for the entire community. Judge Holden, though still facing the pressure of his decision, knew that he had taken the first step in repairing the system, and he couldn't back down now. In the days that followed, the public slowly began to change their perception. Those who had been skeptical started to see the humanity in Maya's story. They began to question the assumptions that had been made about her. The conversation shifted from condemnation to understanding, and the community began to rally behind Maya, hoping for the opportunity to prove that she could rise above her past. Maya's future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of possibility. The legal battle was far from over, but with the support of people who believed in her, she was beginning to feel something she hadn't in years: hope. The day finally came when Judge Patrick Holden would make a public statement regarding the reopening of Maya Johnson's case. Tension filled the courtroom as reporters, activists, and supporters crowded in, all eager to hear what the judge would say. Maya was there too, sitting quietly in the front row, her eyes fixed on the judge's bench. She had not yet been granted a new trial, but the mere fact that her case was being reconsidered felt like a victory in itself. Lucy Carter stood beside her, her expression resolute. The months of hard work, the countless phone calls, interviews, and organizing efforts had all led up to this moment. Though the road had been long and fraught with obstacles, Lucy knew that this was the first real chance Maya had to clear her name. The weight of the moment wasn't lost on her. As Judge Holden entered the courtroom, the noise died down instantly. He looked different, less sure, less the confident figure he had once been. The guilt of his past decisions weighed heavily on him, and the responsibility he felt for what had happened to Maya hung in the air. This was no longer just a legal matter. It was personal. He had failed Maya once, but now he had the chance to make it right. He approached the bench slowly, his eyes scanning the courtroom before settling on Maya. A silence fell over the room as he began to speak, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you today not only as a judge, but as a man who recognizes the mistakes I have made in the past," Judge Holden began. "I sentenced Maya Johnson to 5 years in prison without fully understanding the circumstances that had shaped her life, without considering the trauma and hardship she had endured. I relied too heavily on assumptions and biases, and I failed to see the woman behind the case before me." The courtroom was still, everyone hanging on his words. Maya's heart raced as she listened to him. It was one thing to hear these words from Lucy or a supportive friend. It was another to hear them from the very man who had condemned her. "I cannot undo the harm I caused," the judge continued, "but I can do everything in my power to make sure that the path forward is one of true justice. I am requesting that this case be reopened, that we take a closer look at the circumstances surrounding Maya Johnson's life, and that we ensure her story is heard in its entirety." Lucy's eyes filled with unshed tears. She had known this moment was possible, but hearing it spoken aloud was more than she could have hoped for. This wasn't just a victory for Maya. It was a victory for every person who had ever been unfairly judged or misunderstood by a system that valued efficiency over empathy. The judge paused, then turned his gaze to Maya, offering a brief but sincere nod. "Maya," he said quietly, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the chance to be seen for who you truly are." Maya's throat tightened, and for a moment, she struggled to keep her composure. She had waited so long for this moment, but it still felt surreal. It wasn't just the judge's words. It was the realization that someone, finally, was looking at her not as a criminal, but as a person who had been shaped by forces beyond her control. She had always believed in herself, even when others didn't, but now she felt seen in a way she never had before. The courtroom erupted into murmurs of approval, with some people clapping and others nodding in quiet agreement. It was clear that for many, this moment symbolized something larger than just Maya's case. It was a reminder that justice was not always about black and white rules, but about understanding the complexities of human lives and offering second chances. Judge Holden's motion to reopen the case was granted, and Maya's defense team was now tasked with presenting the full scope of her life, including the emotional and psychological toll of her family's breakdown, her struggles with addiction, and her time spent on the streets. The legal battle had just begun, but for the first time, Maya felt like she had a fighting chance. As Maya walked out of the courtroom, she found herself surrounded by supporters. Some were strangers who had heard her story and rallied behind her, while others were people who had known her before her life had taken such a dark turn. They embraced her with warmth and encouragement, and for the first time in years, Maya allowed herself to believe that redemption might be possible. Lucy turned to her, a smile tugging at her lips. "You did it, Maya. This is just the beginning." Maya nodded, a quiet strength radiating from her. "No, Lucy," she said softly, "we did it." And for the first time in a long while, she felt the weight of her past begin to lift, replaced by the hope of a future where she could truly make a difference. The journey to reopen Maya Johnson's case had been long and arduous, but it was only now, with the trial approaching, that the full impact of everything began to sink in. After months of preparation, Maya's story was about to be told in full. The evidence was stacked in her favor. Testimonies from family, friends, and former mentors painted a picture of a woman who had been abandoned by the systems that were supposed to support her. And now, for the first time, Maya would have the opportunity to stand before Judge Holden and the jury, not as a defendant, but as a human being with a past shaped by pain and loss. The courtroom was packed on the first day of the new trial. Reporters filled the seats along the back, while activists held signs outside, chanting for justice. Maya sat at the defense table, her hands folded neatly in her lap, dressed in a crisp blouse and slacks that made her look more like the woman she once was, before everything had fallen apart. Lucy stood beside her, her presence a steady support in the storm of emotions and anticipation. Judge Holden entered the courtroom, his face serious but determined. He had been here before, but today it felt different. He wasn't the judge who had handed down a harsh sentence without understanding the full context of Maya's life. He was now a man committed to ensuring that Maya's case was heard with the compassion and care it deserved. The trial began with opening statements, and Lucy Carter stepped forward first. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice calm but forceful, "you will hear about the mistakes Maya Johnson made, but I want you to remember one thing above all else. Those mistakes do not define her. What defines Maya is her resilience, her strength, and her humanity. You will learn about a woman who was failed by her family, by society, and by a system that did not see her for who she truly is." Lucy's words echoed in the room, and Maya felt a sense of relief wash over her. For the first time, she wasn't being reduced to her worst decisions. Instead, she was being seen for the person she truly was, a person who had fought every day to survive and who had longed for a chance at redemption. When the defense rested, it was the prosecution's turn. The prosecutor, a stern and practiced attorney, attempted to paint Maya as a repeat offender who had shown no remorse for her actions. He focused on her criminal record, her time spent in prison, and the financial loss caused by the crimes she had committed. Maya listened intently, but as each word was spoken, she could feel her resolve hardening. She wasn't the woman the prosecutor described. She was more than the sum of her mistakes. After the prosecution had finished, it was Maya's turn to take the stand. Her heart pounded as she stood and walked to the witness chair. This was the moment she had been dreading, but also the moment she had been waiting for. She had been silenced for so long. Now she would finally speak her truth. "Maya," Lucy began gently, "can you tell us about your childhood?" Maya hesitated for a moment, gathering her thoughts. "I was a bright child," she said slowly, her voice steady. "I loved school. I loved helping people. But when my parents divorced, everything changed. I didn't understand why things fell apart so quickly. My father was absent, and my mother struggled to hold it all together. I felt abandoned, and I didn't know how to cope with that. I didn't know who I was anymore." Tears welled up in Maya's eyes as she spoke, but she didn't stop. "I turned to substances to numb the pain, to forget that I was losing everything I cared about. But I never stopped trying to be better. I never stopped wanting to make a difference." The courtroom was silent as Maya's words sank in. Her honesty, Her vulnerability was palpable, and it was clear to everyone present that she wasn't just a criminal on trial. She was a woman who had been forced to endure things most people could never understand. When Maya finished her testimony, Judge Holden looked at her, his expression a mixture of regret and admiration. He had heard her story, and now he understood the depth of her pain. The closing arguments were brief, and after several days of deliberation, the jury reached its verdict. The decision was unanimous. Maya Johnson was not guilty of the charges she had faced. Her sentence was overturned, and she was free to go. The room erupted into applause as Maya stood, tears streaming down her face. Lucy hugged her tightly, whispering words of congratulations and relief. Maya couldn't believe it. The justice she had fought for was finally hers. But it wasn't just the legal victory that mattered. It was the recognition of her humanity, her struggle, and her strength. As she walked out of the courthouse that day, Maya felt lighter than she had in years. She wasn't just free from prison. She was free from the weight of a past that had defined her for far too long.